The hall was enormous. It was so large that the ceiling disappeared into a soft blue haze, and the walls curved inward like the inside of a great shell. Thousands of seats filled the space in wide, rising rings, and in those seats sat beings from 47 different worlds. Some had 6 limbs, some had none, some breathed air, some breathed gas that would kill a human in under a minute, some communicated through color shifts in their skin. Some spoke through vibrations in the floor, but they all had one thing in common. They were all looking at the humans. The galactic conclave had existed for over 3,000 years. It was the oldest governing body in the known galaxy. It had seen empires rise. It had watched civilizations collapse under the weight of their own pride. It had brokered peace between species that had been at war for centuries. It was, by every measure, the most powerful institution that had ever existed. And Earth had been given observer status 6 months ago. Observer status was the lowest rank possible in the conclave. It meant humanity was allowed inside the building. It meant they could sit in the room. It did not mean they could vote. It did not mean they could propose anything. It barely meant they could speak. Observer status was what you gave to a species that had somehow stumbled into space travel before they were ready. A polite way of saying, you are here, but you do not matter yet. The human delegation had been assigned seats at the far end of the chamber, near the back wall behind the support pillars. From where they sat, they could barely see the central speaking platform. The Velthari delegation, seated at the front, had made sure of that. The Velthari had been members of the conclave for 2,000 years. They were insectoid in appearance, with long, segmented bodies, pale golden eyes, and movements that were slow and deliberate in the way that only very old things move. They were diplomats by nature. They were condescending by habit. Ambassador Seraphine Okafor sat in the far seat and did not show any of this on her face. She was a tall woman, dark-skinned, with short natural hair and eyes that had the quality of still water. Calm on the surface, unknowable underneath. She had been chosen for this role not just because of her diplomatic training, which was considerable, but because of something harder to name, a stillness, a patience, of the kind that came not from peace, but from purpose. She sat with her hands folded on the small desk in front of her and watched the chamber as it filled. Beside her sat her aide, a young man named Corporal Eli Marsh, who had the unfortunate habit of looking exactly as nervous as he felt. He leaned toward her and whispered, "They put us behind a pillar again." "I noticed," she said. "We can barely see the platform from here." "We can hear everything," she said. "That's enough for today." He looked at her sideways. She did not look back. She was watching the Velthari elder settle into his seat at the front of the chamber. A being named Tel, who was, by various accounts, over 900 years old and who had personally overseen the admission of 11 new species into the conclave. He wore his age in his posture. It's a slight forward bend that had the weight of centuries in it, and he carried a ceremonial staff made of a material no human geologist had ever been able to identify. The session began. The subject of the day was the Outer Rim Crisis. 3-star systems at the edge of mapped space were being slowly swallowed by the Kreth Dominion, a militaristic empire of reptilian conquerors who had spent the last 4 decades expanding their borders by force. The colonies in those systems were small, made up of species too weak to fight back on their own. They had been sending distress signals to the conclave for 8 months. The conclave had been discussing it for 7 of those 8 months. Speaker after speaker rose to the platform and delivered long, elaborate speeches. The Sorvan representative, a 10-foot-tall being made of layered silicon plates with a voice like grinding stone, offered military assistance but attached 17 conditions to it, most of which involved territorial concessions that would benefit the Sorvan directly. The Dranoki Collective, who existed as a linked psychic network and spoke through a single physical representative, declined to act on the grounds of what they called unfavorable resonance patterns in the local sector. This was their way of saying they did not want to get involved. Several smaller species spoke briefly and agreed that something should be done. None of them specified what that something was or who should do it. It went on for 3 hours. Seraphine Okafor listened to all of it without moving. She took notes on a small tablet. She highlighted certain phrases. She drew a small diagram at one point that Eli could not make sense of when he glanced at it. Then, during a pause between speakers, she stood up. The room did not go quiet immediately. It took a moment, a ripple of noticing that moved outward from the human delegation's corner. And when the room did go quiet, the quality of that silence was not respectful. It was the silence of confusion, of the unexpected, of why is the observer standing. Seraphine walked to the end of their row and stepped into the aisle. She moved at a steady pace toward the speaking platform. No one stopped her. The rules technically allowed an observer to request speaking time. No observer had ever actually done it before. She reached the platform and stood at the central podium. The chamber was very still. She looked out at the assembled delegates of 47 civilizations, and she said in a clear and measured voice, "The colonies in the Yora system have been under siege for 8 months. Children are living in underground shelters. Food supplies are running critically low. 3 requests for emergency aid have been submitted to this body, and 3 times this body has tabled the discussion for further deliberation." She paused. "I would like to propose that deliberation end today. I would like to propose that this conclave authorize immediate humanitarian intervention in the Outer Rim systems, and that a joint protective force be assembled within the next 48 hours. There was a silence, and then there was sound. It began with the Velthari. Tael made a clicking noise that, through the translation system, I registered as something between amusement and dismissal. Then a second Velthari delegate joined in. Then 3 more. Then the sound spread. Not laughter as humans understood it, but its functional equivalent, rippling through species after species in their various forms. Color flashing, vibration, a low rhythmic hum from the Sorvan that translated simply as, "How charming." Tal rose slowly from his seat. He did not go to the platform. He did not need to. His voice carried. "Observer," he said, and the word itself was shaped like a reminder. You are only an observer. The conclave appreciates the passion of your species. You are young. You are eager. This is understandable. He let the sounds from the chamber die down before he continued. But passion is not policy. Urgency is not strategy. Wash, you have been in space for, what is it, 60 years? The Kreth Dominion has been a military force for 400. The Sorvayan have been studying the political structure of the Outer Rim for 2 centuries. And you, a species that has not yet completed a single full rotation of this conclave's procedural calendar, stand at that podium and suggest we move in 48 hours. He tilted his great insectoid head slowly. Sit down, little flame. You burn bright and fast. He paused. And then you are simply ash. The chamber responded. It was not subtle. Seraphine stood at the podium for exactly 3 more seconds. She looked at Tal with the expression of someone who has just been told something they already knew. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked back to her seat behind the pillar. Eli was gripping the edge of his desk, though his knuckles were white. "Ambassador," he whispered, his voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. "Not here," she said quietly. "They just—" "I know," she said. "Write it down." "What?" "Write down what he said. The exact words." She opened her tablet again. "We'll want to remember them later." He stared at her. She was already making notes, her face entirely calm, her handwriting neat and even. He looked around at the chamber where the sound had not fully died yet, where delegates from a dozen worlds were still exchanging what he could only assume were jokes at humanity's expense. He picked up his stylus and wrote down the words. "Sit down, little flame. You burn bright and fast, and then you are simply ash." The session ended an hour later with no decision made. The Outer Rim colonies were not helped that day. Another working group was formed. Another report would be filed. Another meeting would be scheduled. The broadcast of the session went out on the Conclave's public channel, which was received by news networks across 200 star systems. The clip of the human ambassador standing at the podium, followed by Tal's response, followed by the chamber's reaction, was the most watched piece of footage in the Conclave's public history within 24 hours. By the end of the week, the word Terran had taken on a new meaning in at least 17 languages. It showed up in jokes, in cartoons. Cargo freighters began painting crude images on their hulls. Small 2-legged figures standing at podiums, flames above their heads. The punchline wrote itself in every language. On a military observation station at the edge of the Cygnus Reach, Admiral Darius Venn watched the broadcast on a small screen bolted to the wall of his command office. He watched it twice. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with gray in his hair and the kind of face that had stopped showing surprise at things a long time ago. He had served 31 years in Earth's military. He had been briefed on Project Sovereign at year 12. He turned off the screen. He sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, the soft hum of the station's systems around him. Then he pulled up a secure line and sent a very short message to a very small number of people. It was 6 words long. They took the bait. Stand ready. No one on the Conclave broadcast team saw that message. No alien intelligence network intercepted it. So no delegate at the Galactic Conclave knew it had been sent. Out in the dark between stars, spread across a dozen hidden coordinates, something began to move. Slowly, quietly, the way it had always been designed to. On Kepler's Rest, a small agricultural colony in the Outer Rim, a farmer named Dosa walked out of her house in the early morning and looked up at the sky. She had watched the broadcast too. She had seen the human ambassador dismissed and laughed at by a chamber full of beings who had never heard of her world, who had no idea her family's food stores were down to 3 weeks' supply, who had voted nothing and decided nothing while her children asked her every evening when help was coming. She stood in the cold morning air for a long time. Then she went back inside and told her children that help was coming soon. She didn't know why she was sure. She simply was. 3 weeks later, she would understand why, but that comes later. For now, the galaxy laughed, and the humans said nothing. And somewhere in the dark, the clock was already running. The Kreth moved fast when they decided to move. That was the one thing every military analyst in the galaxy agreed on. Whatever else you said about the Kreth Dominion, and there was a great deal to say, almost none of it positive, they were efficient. When a Kreth battle group was given an order, it executed that order with speed and coordination that most other species spent generations trying to achieve. They did not hesitate. They did not debate. Their command structure was clean and brutal, and it had served them well for 4 centuries of expansion. Whilst the assault on the Outer Rim's 3 contested systems was a good example of their work. In 11 days, the Kreth had established military blockades around all 3 systems, disabled the local communication relays, and begun the process of formally annexing the colony's governing structures. The residents were not killed. The Kreth were not, in the traditional sense, monsters. They were conquerors, which is a different thing. The people were allowed to live, work, eat, as long as they acknowledged Kreth authority and paid the required tribute. The Galactic Conclave issued a formal statement of concern. The Kreth did not respond to it. The Conclave formed a new working group. The Kreth finished installing their flag on the administrative buildings of Eurostation. On the 2nd day of the 3rd week, a fleet of human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Eurosystem. There were 43 vessels in total. By the standards of major galactic powers, it was a small fleet. The Kreth battle group stationed in the system counted 91 warships and immediately transmitted a mocking report back to Dominion Command. The numbers were almost funny. The humans had brought fewer than half their own ships to a fight they had not been invited to, in a system that was now legally, at least by Dominion law, Kreth territory. The Kreth commander, a veteran officer named Battlelord Vrak, did not take it as a serious threat. He sent one transmission. This is Kreth Dominion space. You're in violation of established territorial claims. So you have 2 hours to withdraw before we treat your presence as an act of war. The response came back in under a minute, and it was from Admiral Darius Venn. We are the Terran Expeditionary Vanguard. We are here because those colonies asked for help. We would prefer a peaceful resolution, but we are not leaving. Battlelord Vrak stared at the translation for a long moment. Then he laughed. A Kreth laugh, which was a sharp exhale through the nostrils that sounded like a small explosion, and ordered his fleet to engage. What followed would later be called the Siege of Eurostation in history books, both human and alien, though the accounts differed significantly in tone. The Kreth account described it as a straightforward engagement in which they successfully defended their territorial claim against an inferior human force, when ultimately driving back the Terran vanguard at a cost that was higher than expected, but within acceptable parameters. The human account was shorter. It said, Round 1, as planned. The battle lasted 19 hours. The Kreth had the numbers, the heavier ships, and the positional advantage of already being in the system. They pressed all three advantages without hesitation. Their tactics were standard and effective. A wedge formation that split the human fleet, concentrated fire on individual ships before they could regroup, used their mass to push the humans back toward the system's outer edge, and the humans let them. This was the thing that bothered Battlelord Vrak, though he would not admit it until much later. The humans did not fight the way you fought when you were trying to hold a position. They fought the way you fought when you were trying to learn something. Every time a human ship was driven back, it seemed to be noting something. Every time a formation failed, a new one appeared. Different, adapted, pulling from wherever the Kreth pressure was weakest. They took damage. Several ships were destroyed, but the rest kept moving, kept adjusting, kept refusing to do the same thing twice, and they never panicked. Every military force in the galaxy had a breaking point, a moment when the pressure became too great and the formation started to collapse from the inside. Soldiers fled, commanders hesitated, ships broke formation, and the coherent force became a scatter of individuals. Vrak had seen it in Servan forces, in Velthari peacekeepers, in half a dozen other species he had fought or watched fight. It was universal. It was, in his experience, simply what living things did under enough pressure. The humans did not break. They bent. They moved. They absorbed. But the unit coherence never collapsed. Ven's fleet pulled back in a pattern that was, technically, a retreat, but that did not feel like one. It felt like something being stored, energy being compressed. When it was over, the Terran vanguard had withdrawn to the outer edge of the system. Yora Station was still in Kreth hands. By every traditional measure, the Kreth had won. But Vrak sat in his command chair and looked at his damage reports for a long time. He had lost 40% of his assault fleet's forward attack wing. Not destroyed, mostly disabled, systems damaged, drives knocked out. Humans seemed to have a preference for disabling over destroying, enemy, which was strategically unusual and in its own way, unsettling. But 40%. For a battle against a force half his size, in a system he had already controlled, against a species that had been traveling in space for 60 years. He wrote up his report. He sent it to Dominion Command. Dominion Command sent back a form letter congratulating him on the successful defense of the system. Vrak read the letter. He read it twice. Then he filed it and started writing a second, private report to his personal superior, a Kreth general named Scarith, who was known for actually reading his correspondence. These creatures did not fight to win the battle, he wrote. They fought to understand us. I do not know yet what they will do with what they have learned. But I am recommending we treat the next engagement with considerably more caution than High Command is currently applying. He sent it. General Scarith read it within the hour and immediately elevated it to priority status. He had been watching the human fleet's behavior across 3 smaller skirmishes in the Outer Rim over the past 10 days, probing engagements, some called them, and the pattern he was seeing did not fit any of his training. Human ships took risks that should have been suicidal and survived them through what could only be described as improvised creativity. They operated as a group but moved like individuals. They communicated on frequencies his signals team had never been able to fully decode. He wrote his own report to Supreme Command. Supreme Command dismissed it as excessive caution from an officer who had not yet seen enough war. Scarith filed the dismissal, went back to his desk, and continued watching. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Galactic Conclave was very upset about the humans. Not about the Kreth, not about the colonies being annexed, about the humans. The humans had taken unilateral military action without Conclave authorization. They had deployed a fleet into a contested region without any formal mandate. They had not consulted anyone. They had not filed any prior notice. They had simply gone. Tal summoned the human delegation to an emergency closed session. Seraphine Okafor attended with Eli Marsh beside her, and no one else. Tal wasted no time. You had no authority to deploy forces into the Outer Rim, he said. So your intervention was illegal under Conclave statutes. You will withdraw your fleet immediately and submit a full accounting of your military capabilities to this body for review. Seraphine looked at him calmly. The colonies asked us for help, she said. We went. That is not how this institution functions. With respect, she said, this institution has been discussing those colonies for 8 months and has not helped them once. We have been there for 3 weeks. Supplies have been delivered. Medical teams are on the ground. The Kreth have been slowed. She folded her hands on the table. We are happy to discuss the legal aspects of our deployment at any time. We are not withdrawing the fleet. There was a very long silence. You are an observer species, Tal said, and his voice had something in it now. Not quite anger, but something that sat beside anger. You have no standing to. The people on those colonies are alive, she said. That is the only standing I need today. The session did not go well after that. Formally, a motion was filed against the human delegation for procedural misconduct. It passed 17-14. Several species abstained. The Sorvan representative voted against the motion, which surprised everyone in the room, including Seraphine. She noted it on her tablet. Back in the Outer Rim, Admiral Venn regrouped his fleet and resupplied from 2 support vessels that had been waiting in the dark at the edge of the system. He reviewed the battle data from Eurostation with his senior officers, a group of men and women who shared a quality difficult to name. A kind of deliberate calm, as though they had all agreed, some time ago, to stop being surprised by things. They hit harder than the first projections, said Commander Yara Tesh, his tactical lead, pointing to a set of numbers on the display. Their forward cruisers run approximately 15% heavier than our intelligence suggested. Good, said Venn. Good, said a junior officer at the back. Venn looked at him. The junior officer, a young lieutenant named Castile, who had never been in live combat before this deployment, had the expression of someone who had not slept well. Yes, said Venn. We now know exactly how hard they hit. We know their formation preference, their communication pattern, their response time when a wing takes unexpected damage. He tapped the display. We paid for that information in ships and in lives, and I do not take that lightly. However, but we now know things about the Kreth's combat behavior that no one in this galaxy has ever mapped before. He looked at his team. Round 2 will go differently. Lieutenant Castile opened his mouth, then closed it, then said, Do we have enough ships for a round 2? Venn looked at him for a long moment. We have enough ships for what's needed, he said. Get some sleep, Lieutenant. He did not explain what he meant. None of his senior officers asked because they already knew. They had all read the same briefing documents, the same classified files, the same projections that had been built over the course of 2 centuries and kept in sealed servers that most of Earth's government did not even know existed. They knew what was coming. They knew what this was. This was not a war. This was an introduction. A very specific kind of introduction. The kind designed to be watched closely by a galaxy that had been laughing for months. The kind designed to let every scanner, drone, and observation and satellite and intelligence network in the Conclave's reach gather data. The kind designed to look like struggle. Because the galaxy needed to see humanity struggle first. It needed to believe that what it had seen was the truth of what humans were. Small, stubborn, outmatched, fighting anyway. It needed to believe that right up until the moment it was too late to revise the belief. Venn looked out of the viewport at the stars and thought about a man named Dr. Yuan Chao, who was very old now and lived in a facility with no public address, and who had once told him, in the early years of Venn's career, that the hardest part of the whole plan was not the building, not the hiding, not the waiting. The hardest part, Chao had said, was losing on purpose and not flinching. Venn thought about the ships he had lost at Eurostation. He thought about the names he would have to read tomorrow morning. He did not flinch. But it cost him something. It always did. The transport ship had no name on its hull, no registration number, no flag. It looked from the outside like a cargo vessel. Blocky, unremarkable, the kind of ship that moved through space without drawing attention because there was nothing interesting enough about it to look at twice. Its course, if anyone had bothered to track it, ran through 3 separate transit lanes before it left the mapped routes entirely and moved into a region of space that did not appear on commercial star charts. Seraphine Okafor sat in the small cabin and looked out the single porthole at the stars. She had been recalled from the conclave 2 days after the closed session with Tal. The recall notice had come through a channel that did not officially exist, on a frequency she had memorized before she ever set foot in the conclave chamber for the first time. She had told Eli Marsh that she was taking a medical leave and that he would represent the delegation in her absence. He had looked at her with the expression he always wore when he suspected he was not being told everything, which was frequently. She had told him to keep notes, and the transport flew for 9 hours after leaving the last mapped route. Then it slowed. Then it entered what looked, on the sensors, like an empty patch of space between two unremarkable star systems. Too far from either to be useful, too empty to be interesting. And then the facility appeared. It did not uncloak exactly. The effect was more subtle than that. It was as though the space around it simply stopped pretending to be empty. One moment there was nothing. The next there was a structure that was larger than any space station Seraphine had ever seen. And she had been to the Sorvin's orbital ring, which was considered one of the great engineering achievements of the age. The Vault of Arden was not designed to impress. It was designed to function, and there was a difference. Where the Sorvian ring was elegant and grand, the vault was dense and purposeful. Layer after layer of construction, modules and docks and antenna arrays and docking bays stacked on each other with the logic of something that had been built and added to over a very long time. The transport docked without ceremony. Seraphine walked through 3 security checkpoints, each one requiring both biological identification and a code spoken aloud. The codes changed every 48 hours. She had received today's code on the transport in a file that deleted itself after she read it. At the 3rd checkpoint, a door opened into a corridor that was clean and well lit and completely silent, and at the end of that corridor stood a man. Dr. Yuan Chao was 83 years old and looked somehow both older and younger than that. He was small and thin, with white hair cut close to his head and eyes that had the sharp quality of someone who had spent decades looking at very small details very carefully. He wore no uniform. He had retired from any official role 14 years ago, which was publicly known. What was not publicly known was that he had not retired from this. He would never retire from this. "Seraphine," he said and shook her hand. His grip was still firm. "Dr. Chow," she said, "how long do I have?" "A few hours, then you need to be back in position." He turned and began walking down the corridor. "Walk with me. I want to show you something you haven't seen before." They moved through the vault for several minutes, passing through sections that Seraphine recognized. The communications hub, the strategic analysis wing, and the data archive that held 200 years of accumulated intelligence. Then they turned a corner and entered a part of the facility she had not visited before. The corridor widened. The lighting changed from white to a deep amber, and through a long observation window on her left, she saw what was below. She stopped walking. The space below the window was vast, a construction bay the size of a small city, and in it, row after row of ships. Not the kind of ships Earth showed the galaxy. Not the 43 vessels of the Terran Expeditionary Vanguard, which were real ships with real crews who were doing real and difficult things in the Outer Rim right now. These were something else entirely. They were large. They were dark, built in a matte black material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Or their lines were clean and severe, without the small decorative elements that most species added to their military vessels as a matter of tradition or pride. There were no flags on their hulls, no names, no unit insignia. There were so many of them that the far end of the bay was hidden in shadow. "How many?" she asked. "In this bay, 812, Chow said. He paused. "This is one of 5 bays." She did not say anything for a moment. "The galaxy has no idea," she said. "No," he said, and that was always the point. He began walking again, slowly, and she fell into step beside him. "When I was a young man," he said, "I was part of the first team that reviewed the full record of conclave history. Not the public record, the actual record. The wars, the collapses, and the moments when powerful civilizations made decisions that destroyed smaller ones simply because they could." He paused. "Do you know what the single most common factor was in every case where a smaller civilization was destroyed or absorbed against its will?" They were seen as weak, she said. More specific than that, he said. They were seen as weak and known to be weak. The important part is the second half. If you are weak but your enemy doesn't know the extent of it, they are cautious. They plan. They prepare. But if your weakness is visible, fully mapped, fully understood, then the calculation becomes very simple. There is no caution needed, no preparation. You simply move. He looked at her. Earth made contact with the conclave 60 years ago. What was the first thing every intelligence service on every major world did? Mapped us, she said. Mapped us completely, he said. Our military capability, our population, our industrial output, our psychological patterns. They built a full picture of what humanity was and what humanity had. And what they found was accurate. We were small. We were young. We were limited. He stopped walking again. They were at another window, this one looking down on a different space. Not ships, but something else. Long rows of equipment she recognized as bioarmor fabrication units, and beside them, weapons testing chambers, and beside those, rows of what she could only describe as thinking machines. Towering server structures that hummed with a sound you felt more than heard. So we let them keep that picture, he said. In Oz, we maintained it very carefully. Every ship we showed the galaxy was the right kind of ship. Real, functional, capable, but sized exactly for what they expected from us. Every military exercise we allowed observation drones to see was calibrated to demonstrate ability without revealing scale. Every ambassador we sent to the conclave was genuinely there to learn and to represent, but also to be underestimated. He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was not quite an apology, but sat close to one. Including you, he said. I know, she said. I've always known. Does that bother you? She thought about standing at the podium in the conclave chamber. She thought about Tal's voice. Sit down, little flame. She thought about the sound that filled the chamber afterward. Yes, that spreading alien amusement that had been rebroadcast across 200 star systems. It used to, she said. Now it just makes me patient. He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded, as though that was exactly the right answer. They walked for another few minutes in silence before reaching a room at the end of a secured corridor. A briefing room, clean and functional, with a table and chairs and a wall display that showed a star map of the outer rim. On the map, 3 systems were marked in red. In the space between them, a 4th marking had appeared recently, a blinking indicator in a place where no marking had previously existed. Chow went to the display and pointed at the blinking indicator. Kepler's Rest, he said. Small agricultural colony. Population of about 20,000. They are not strategic. They are not valuable in any military sense. They are not positioned near any significant resource or transit route. He paused. 17 days ago, a Kreth reconnaissance patrol overflew the colony at low altitude. They did not attack. They did not land. They left. Seraphine looked at the marking. They found the array, she said. We believe so, yes. Chow sat down in one of the chairs. He suddenly looked his age in a way he had not before. The deep communication array beneath Kepler's Rest has been there for 40 years. It is the anchor point for the entire long-range coordination network that ties the Warden fleet together. If the Kreth attack that colony, they aren't attacking the colony, she said. They're sending us a message. Yes. She sat down across from him. They know, she said. Or they suspect. They suspect something, he said. Not the scale, not the full picture, but something in the human combat behavior in the outer rim has made their smarter analysts nervous. General Scarith has filed 3 escalating reports with Supreme Command. Supreme Command has dismissed all of them. He folded his hands on the table. But Scarith is not the one we need to worry about. We need to worry about whoever authorized that low overflight of Kepler's Rest. That was not random. Someone gave that order knowing what they might find. Or wanting to see how we'd react, she said. Exactly. She looked at the star map for a long time. The blinking indicator at Kepler's Rest seemed to pulse with a kind of urgency, though that was just her mind layering meaning onto a simple navigation marker. How long before they move on the colony, she asked. Based on current Kreth fleet positioning, Our best estimate is 10 to 14 days. She looked at him. And the Warden fleet? He met her eyes. Ready, he said. They have been ready for 6 years. Admiral Venn has the operational command structure in place. The coordination protocols have been tested and retested. Every ship commander knows their assignment. He paused. We have been waiting for the right moment. Not just a military moment, the right political moment. The conclave needs to see this. The whole galaxy needs to see this. If we move too early or too quietly, it becomes just another battle report, just another military engagement. He leaned forward slightly. It needs to be visible. It needs to be undeniable. It needs to happen in a way that answers, impermanently, the question of what humanity is. And Kepler's rest gives us that, she said. If the Kreth attack it, and we respond, every observer drone, every intelligence network, every news feed in the conclave's reach will be watching the outer rim. We have made sure of that. The coverage has been building for weeks. He paused. They will be watching when we move. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Seraphine said, the people on Kepler's rest, the 20,000, will be evacuated in the next 72 hours, he said. Quietly. Agricultural emergency. A chemical issue with the water supply. Standard evacuation protocols. No one will look twice at it. He met her eyes. We do not sacrifice civilians. Not ever. Not for any plan. She nodded. He stood and walked to the wall display. He touched it and the map expanded, pulling back to show a wider view. The outer rim, the core conclave systems, and scattered across the dark between them, dozens of small markers she recognized as the Warden fleet's current holding positions. Spread out, invisible, patient. 200 years, he said quietly, looking at the map. 200 years of building and hiding and waiting. 2 generations of engineers and commanders and analysts who spent their careers on something they would never see finished. He was quiet for a moment. My grandfather was part of the first design committee. He died before we had 20 ships. He never saw any of this. He turned from the display. We never needed their respect, Seraphine, he said. We needed their underestimation. And they gave it to us freely. He picked up a data chip from the table and held it out to her. This is your part of what comes next. You'll know when to use it. She took the chip. It was small and plain and cool in her palm. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket and stood up. I should get back, she said. Yes, he said. Go sit behind your pillar. Be patient a little longer. She almost smiled. Tell Admiral Venn I said, on time, not early. Chow nodded. He already knows. She left the room and walked back through the long corridors of the Vault of Arden, past the humming server rows and the fabrication units, and the observation windows that looked out over thousands of ships that the galaxy did not know existed. At the outer dock, she reboarded the nameless transport. It flew back the way it had come, through the dark, and the facility disappeared behind it as quietly as it had appeared. The stars looked the same as they always had, but something in the space between them was different now. The silence was ending. The Kreth attacked Kepler's rest on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything to the Kreth. The Kreth did not measure time in Earth units, but Seraphine Okafor, sitting in the conclave chamber when the news reached her earpiece, thought about it afterward, that the thing the galaxy had been quietly waiting for, the thing 200 years of human patience had been building toward, had arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The attack was a ground assault, not an orbital bombardment, not a full fleet engagement. The Kreth landed a force of soldiers on the surface of Kepler's rest, which moved on the administrative center and began the process of taking control. The colony appeared, to all visible evidence, to be inhabited. The lights were on, the machinery was running, the systems were active. The Kreth did not know that the 20,000 residents had been quietly relocated over the previous 72 hours under the cover of a chemical water emergency that had been, to every outside observer, completely routine. So the Kreth soldiers found empty buildings, and in the basement of the main administrative hub, they found a communications array that was significantly more sophisticated than anything a small agricultural colony had any reason to own. The Kreth commander on the ground sent an immediate report to Fleet Command. Fleet Command sent it up the chain. The chain reached General Scarth within 40 minutes. Scareth had been waiting for something like this. He had been warning about something like this. He immediately flagged it, escalated it, and requested emergency clearance to begin a full-scan sweep of all Outer Rim systems for possible hidden human infrastructure. Supreme Command told him to stand by. Scareth sat at his desk and thought that stand by was becoming the most dangerous phrase in the Kreth military vocabulary. He was right. He just didn't know yet quite how right he was. 7 hours after the ground assault on Kepler's Rest, at a moment that had been chosen with precision and deliberateness, and a great deal of thought about light, distance, and the positions of every conclave observation satellite in the sector, Admiral Darius Venn gave a single command. He said, "Upper now." Across the Outer Rim and the surrounding sectors of space, in the dark between star systems, in the shadow of gas giants, in the sensor-blind zones behind moons and asteroid clusters, in holding positions that had been maintained with extraordinary discipline for 6 years, 4,000 ships received that signal simultaneously. They moved. The first sign the Kreth had was not a sensor alarm. It was not a threat alert or a weapons lock. The first sign was a sound that traveled through the hull of every Kreth vessel in the Outer Rim. A deep, low vibration that had no obvious source. It was the sound of FTL translation waves arriving. Many of them, from many directions, all at once. Now, Battlelord Vrak was on the bridge of his flagship when his sensor officer turned from his console with an expression that Vrak had never seen on a Kreth officer before. It was not panic exactly. It was the face of someone trying to process data that didn't fit into any category they had ever been trained to handle. "Sir," the sensor officer said, "I'm reading." He stopped. He looked at his console again. He ran a diagnostic check that took 4 seconds. He looked up. "I'm reading 4,000 separate FTL translation signatures, all within engagement range." Vrak stared at him. "That's not—" He stopped. "Run it again." "I've run it 3 times." Vrak walked to the sensor console himself and looked at the display. 4,000 signatures, spread across a volume of space that encompassed every Kreth military asset in the region. Not clustered, not massed in a single attack formation, positioned, deliberately, precisely, with evident knowledge of exactly where every Kreth ship was, in a surrounding arc that covered every viable exit vector simultaneously. The ships appeared out of FTL one by one over the course of 30 seconds, the whole sequence perfectly staggered, so that each new arrival was visible before the next one came. It was not an accident. It was a presentation. The humans wanted every scanner, every sensor, every observation drone in the sector to capture each ship clearly. Dark hulls, matte black, absorbing light. No markings visible at standard range. No flags, no unit insignia. Just the shape of them. Long, severe, functional. Multiplied 4,000 times across the sky. Vrak had fought in 11 campaigns. He had never felt anything in a battle before except calculation. Cold, clear calculation. He was an experienced officer, and he had always believed that experience was the cure for fear. He felt something now that his experience had no cure for. He pressed the fleet-wide communication link. "All units hold position," he said, and was grateful that his voice came out flat and even. "Do not fire, do not maneuver, hold." Because he had understood something in the first moment of seeing that display, something that cut through all the training and experience in strategic instinct. He had understood that if these ships had wanted to destroy his fleet, they already would have. The positioning was too perfect. There were no gaps, no errors, no vulnerabilities in the arc they had formed. If this had been an attack, it would already be finished. This was not an attack. This was something else. For 4 minutes, no one moved, no one fired, no human ship transmitted anything. They simply existed. 4,000 dark ships surrounding the Kreth fleet, waiting with a patience that felt almost geological. 4 minutes of silence during which every observation network in the sector captured and recorded and transmitted the image to every connected system in the conclave's reach. A farmer's colony on a distant world paused its morning harvest to watch the feed on a community screen. A Velthari diplomatic aide stopped in the middle of a corridor and stood staring at her personal display. In a Sorbonne military academy, Unveiled instructor halted mid-lecture as the alert came through and simply stood at the front of the room with the expression of someone revising a very large number of previous assumptions. In the Galactic Conclave chamber, delegates who had been in the middle of their morning sessions stopped everything. The displays built into every delegate's desk were showing the same feed. Tyle of the Valthari sat very still, his golden eyes fixed on the image of 4,000 ships. Then at the end of exactly 4 minutes, Admiral Ven's voice came through on all frequencies. It was calm, almost gentle, as though he were addressing a minor scheduling conflict rather than an entire military empire. This is Admiral Darius Ven of the Terran Warden Fleet. The Kreth Dominion will stand down from all occupied territories in the Outer Rim within 48 hours, release all colonists currently under administrative detention, and withdraw to Dominion origin space. If this is done, we will withdraw our fleet and no further action will be required. If it is not done, we will demonstrate, thoroughly and without malice, why we have been quiet for so long. You have 48 hours. The transmission ended. The Kreth did not stand down. It was, in retrospect, probably inevitable. The Kreth Dominion had been a military empire for 400 years. It had not survived 4 centuries by yielding to ultimatums. It had survived by fighting always, even when the odds were poor, because in the Kreth strategic philosophy, the act of not fighting was worse than any defeat. You could recover from a defeat. You could not recover from being known as the civilization that surrendered without a shot. Supreme Command gave the order to engage. The battle, if it could be called a battle, lasted 11 hours. The Kreth fought with everything they had. Their ships were powerful, their crews experienced, their tactical commanders among the best they had developed. They formed into their most effective configurations, executed their best-tested strategies, pushed their weapons systems to maximum output. And they found that it didn't matter. Not because the human ships were simply more powerful, though they were. Not because the human weapons were superior, though they were. But because of something that went beyond the hardware. Something in the way the Warden fleet moved, the way it responded, the way it seemed to know what the Kreth were going to do almost before the Kreth did it. 200 years of studying Kreth combat behavior, a century of AI war simulation running every possible scenario. Every battle report, every tactical record, every piece of intercepted Kreth military communication filed and analyzed and fed into a strategic understanding so complete and so deep that engaging it was like trying to punch water. The Warden fleet did not destroy the Kreth ships. This was the thing that broke the Kreth commanders more than anything else. Time after time, in engagement after engagement across 6 simultaneous theaters of operation, the human ships moved to disable rather than destroy. Drives were targeted. Weapon systems were shut down. Communication arrays were cut. Ship after ship was left powerless and adrift. Crews alive, life support intact, hulls undamaged, but completely, utterly unable to fight. It was precise, it was almost careful, and it was more humiliating than destruction would have been. By the time the Kreth Supreme Command transmitted its surrender, 2/3 of their Outer Rim military force was floating quietly in space, unable to move. General Scarth, who had been correct about everything, who had warned and been dismissed and been right, sat in his command chair on his flagship with his weapons offline and his drives dark. And he thought about his 3 reports to Supreme Command and about the word stand by. And he looked out at the dark ships surrounding him and he thought, they were always going to do this. They were always going to be this. Hey, we just didn't look properly. The colonies were released within the hour. Simultaneously in the Galactic Conclave, Seraphine Okafor stood up from her seat behind the pillar at the far end of the hall. She walked down the aisle. The chamber was very quiet, not the confused quiet of before, a different kind of quiet, the quiet of people who are reassessing something fundamental and finding the process deeply unsettling. She reached the central podium and stood there for a moment, looking out at the assembled delegates of 47 civilizations. Then she did something unexpected. She walked away from the podium. She walked to the central table, the great circular table in the middle of the chamber, around which the senior delegates of the most powerful conclave members sat. She stopped at the edge of the table. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out a small data chip. She placed it on the table. She slid it, gently and deliberately, to the center. This chip contains a full, unredacted record of Project Sovereign, she said. Her voice was very quiet, but the chamber acoustics carried it perfectly. Every ship, every station, every capability, every facility, the full history of the project from its beginning to today. She paused. We have been building this for 200 years. We have chosen, until this moment, not to share it. We hope the events of today demonstrate that our reason for that choice was not aggression or deception for its own sake, but caution. The same caution any species exercises when it is learning who its neighbors truly are. She looked at Tell. And he had not moved since the feeds had started coming in hours ago. He sat in his seat like something carved from old stone. We are no longer an observer species, she said. We would like a proper seat at this table, not because of what we have shown today, but because of what we have chosen not to do with it. She let that sit in the air for a moment. We had the means to make very different choices. We did not. She did not smile. She did not perform triumph. She simply stood there, still impatient, the same way she had stood at the podium the first time, when the whole chamber had laughed. Nobody laughed now. Tell looked at the chip in the center of the table for a long time. Then he looked at her. He said nothing, but his hands, she noticed, were not entirely still. Where the data chip sat in the center of the conclave table for 3 hours before anyone touched it. It was not that the delegates were afraid of it, not exactly. It was more that touching it felt like an acknowledgement, like confirming physically that what they had seen in the past 11 hours was real, was permanent, was something that could not be walked back or reinterpreted or filed away in a committee report until the significance of it faded. The chip was small and plain and sat in the middle of the table like a question no one was ready to answer yet. Eventually, a Servan administrator, not the delegate, but a staff member, which perhaps made it easier, picked it up and transferred the contents to the conclave's secure archive. The process took 4 minutes. Nobody spoke during those 4 minutes. Nobody looked directly at anyone else. Then the session that followed, the one that would later be described in academic texts as the reckoning session, though it was never officially named, began. It was not a comfortable session. The first thing that happened was that 11 different intelligence offices simultaneously published emergency internal assessments. They had all been running frantically for the past several hours, pulling every piece of data they had ever collected on Earth and re-examining it through the lens of what they now knew. The assessments all reached similar conclusions, and they all carried similar tones. The careful, professionally worded tone of institutions, trying to explain why they had been comprehensively and completely wrong about something for 60 years. The Velthari Intelligence Directorate's assessment was perhaps the most thorough, because the Velthari were meticulous by nature. They went back through every interaction with a human diplomat and reread it, every trade negotiation, every border discussion, every session of the conclave where a human representative had spoken or been spoken to. They looked for patterns they had missed. They found many. The human delegations had always been very good at asking questions, not demanding answers, asking questions. Thoughtful, specific, patient questions that gathered information while giving very little back. The humans had always been willing to accept unfavorable terms in negotiations, which the Velthari had interpreted as weakness. Looking back, it was clear that the terms they had accepted were always terms that cost them very little in practice, while giving them something they wanted that was not immediately obvious. A precedent, an access point, a quietly established relationship. The Velthari analyst who wrote that section of the report sat back from her desk when she finished it and stayed very still for a while. They were learning us, she wrote, while letting us believe we were teaching them. At the conclave session, the Sorvan representative, the one who had voted against the procedural misconduct motion weeks ago, requested the floor early. His name was Elder War Rosa, and he was one of the oldest active Sorvan diplomats, which meant he was also one of the most respected. He stood at the podium and said something that surprised nearly everyone. He said, "I owe the Terran delegation an apology." The chamber was very still. "Not for anything that was done formally," he said. "We never formally wronged them. But I sat in this chamber for 8 months and said nothing useful while people in the outer rim went without help. The humans went. They sent their ships and their people to a fight that was not their obligation, for colonies that were not theirs, for species that had never done them any favor. He paused. And then we were angry at them for it, because it made us look at what we had chosen not to do. He stepped back from the podium. I will not make that argument again. I am done confusing process with purpose. The room was quiet for a moment. When then the Drenoshi representative, the physical body through which the collective spoke, made a soft sound that translated as reluctant agreement. It was not an apology. The Drenoshi did not apologize as a rule, but it was something. Seraphine sat in her seat, the one behind the pillar, and watched all of it and wrote notes on her tablet and kept her face completely neutral. Because the session was not over yet, because the most important moment was still coming, and she knew it, and she needed to be patient for a little longer. That moment came when Tal asked to speak. He moved slowly, as he always did, with the weight of centuries in every step. He went to the podium. He did not look at his notes. He never used notes. He stood for a moment looking out at the chamber with his golden eyes. And then he looked directly at Seraphine. Observer Ambassador Okafor, he said, would you come to the platform? She set down her tablet. She walked to the platform. She stood beside him, which was itself unusual, the Velthari elder and the human ambassador, sharing the podium, which had never happened in 6 months of conclave sessions. I would like to request a private meeting, he said. Not a session, not a negotiation, a conversation, between myself and the ambassador, in a room with no recording, no translation staff, just the two of us. He turned to the chamber. I am certain this will violate 7 procedural statutes. I am requesting an exception. The exception was granted in under 2 minutes. They met that evening in a small room off the secondary corridor, a room used normally for storage, which had been hastily cleared of equipment and furnished with 2 chairs and a table. There was no translator unit. Tal spoke the human language passably well, which Seraphine had known but which he had never bothered to demonstrate before. He sat across from her and was quiet for a long moment. There was something different about him in this room, away from the formality of the chamber. He seemed improbably smaller, not physically. His age and his bearing were exactly the same. But there was something that had been stripped away from him, and what was left was something older and simpler than a diplomat. You let us laugh at you, he said. It was not quite a question, but she answered it anyway. Yes, she said. That moment I said, sit down, little flame. You let that happen. We needed it to happen, she said. Amra and I had been briefed that it would. She paused. I want you to understand something. I was not performing patience in that chamber. The anger was real. The moment was genuinely unpleasant. She met his eyes. But there are things that are worth being patient for. He looked at her for a long time. You chose this deliberately, he said. The whole sequence, the small fleet in the outer rim that struggled, the battles you lost, the sessions where you said little and we dismissed you, all of it was a way of learning who you were, she said. Not your weapons, not your ships, your character. What a civilization does when it has power and doesn't know its neighbor has any, that tells you everything. She paused. The conclave has been here for 3,000 years. It has watched civilizations rise and fall. It is full of history and wisdom and experience. And when it thought we were small and weak, it put us behind a pillar and laughed at us. She paused again. We needed to know that. He was silent for a while. And if we had been kinder, he said, then the plan would have adapted, she said. We were not hoping for cruelty. We were watching for truth. She folded her hands on the table. The cruelty, when it came, was useful information. It told us we needed to be stronger before we became known. It confirmed what the historical record already suggested, that in this galaxy, respect comes from capability, and capability must be demonstrated. She looked at him steadily. We demonstrated it today, not by destroying anything, not by conquering anyone, by ending something that needed ending and then stopping. He nodded slowly. Or the Kreth, he said. The Kreth are not our enemies, when she said. They are a civilization that made a series of choices we needed to correct. Their civilians are unhurt. Their infrastructure is intact. Their military is humbled but alive. She paused. We didn't come here to be feared. We came to be taken seriously. There is a difference. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said quietly, I am 914 years old. In that time, I have been wrong about many things. I have been corrected before. He paused. But I have not, in 914 years, been corrected quite like this. She didn't answer. He stood up slowly and straightened his robes. I will be proposing at tomorrow's session that the Terran delegation be elevated to full membership, he said, with voting rights, and a seat at the primary table. He paused. Not because of the fleet, because of what was done with it. He looked at her. What you said to the chamber this afternoon. We had the means to make very different choices. We did not. That is the measure of a civilization that belongs at this table. He left the room. Seraphine sat alone for a moment in the small, barely furnished room, in the chair that had been pulled from storage. She looked at the ceiling. Somewhere very far away, in a facility with no name on a star chart that didn't exist, an old man was probably watching a news feed and feeling something that took too long to name. She thought about all the people who had built what had been shown today and had never seen it. Engineers who had spent their careers in secret. Commanders who had drilled for a mission they would not live to execute. Analysts who had worked in the dark for decades. Her own parents who had known, in general terms, what she was being trained for, and who had never asked questions they weren't supposed to ask. She thought about the farmer on Kepler's Rest. Dosa, whose name had appeared in one of the civilian evacuation reports, who had told her children on faith alone that help was coming. The motion was passed the following morning. Not unanimously, 6 species abstained and 2 voted against. But the majority was clear. The seat at the primary table was moved. The pillar was no longer in the way. In the months that followed, the galaxy restructured itself around a fact it was still learning to hold. Species that had dismissed humanity began reaching out. When trade proposals arrived at Earth's diplomatic offices at a rate that required 3 new staff members just to catalog them. Military alliances were proposed carefully by species that had watched the Outer Rim engagement and done the quiet math of what it meant to be on good terms with the Warden fleet. Earth accepted some, declined others, moved slowly and carefully and without arrogance, because the lesson that had driven 200 years of preparation had not been forgotten simply because the preparation was over. The lesson was permanent. It was structural. It was built into every policy meeting and every diplomatic briefing and every decision about how to use what humanity now openly possessed. The lesson was this: power without restraint is just violence, and violence without purpose is just noise. The Kreth Dominion went through a long and difficult internal period. Supreme Command was replaced. Several military commanders faced accountability processes. General Scareth was given a role he had never sought, overseeing the restructuring of Kreth military doctrine, and took it because there was no one better suited, and he was not the kind of being who declined a necessary thing simply because it was hard. He requested, through formal diplomatic channels, a meeting with Admiral Venn. Venn agreed to it. They met on neutral ground, in a station above a small, unremarkable world, and they talked for 4 hours about military philosophy and the nature of conflict and what it meant to be a soldier in a galaxy where the rules had just changed. It was not a warm meeting, but it was an honest one, and at the end of it, Scareth said something Venn would remember. You were never reckless, Scareth said. We thought you were reckless. Your behavior looked like recklessness to us, but it wasn't. It was something we didn't have a word for. Venn thought about it. Patience with a deadline, he said. Scareth considered that. Yes, he said. That is what it was. Time passed. Nearly a year after the Reckoning session, a new species made contact with the Galactic Conclave. They had only just achieved faster-than-light travel. Their ships were small and their technology was modest, and they arrived at the outer edges of mapped space with the careful, wide-eyed quality of something that has just discovered how big the universe is and has not yet decided whether that is wonderful or terrifying. Their diplomatic representatives came to the conclave and were given observer status. The lowest rank, the starting point, the traditional beginning. They were assigned seats in the outer rings. On the morning of their first full session, as they were preparing to enter the chamber, an old Velthari aide named Saros, who had worked for Tile for 60 years and had been present in the chamber on the day the humans had first been laughed at, leaned down toward the lead diplomat of the new species. She was young and nervous, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "A piece of advice," Saros said, "before you go in." She looked up at him. "Whatever you do when you meet the humans, do not underestimate them." She blinked. "Why?" He glanced toward the chamber doors, which were just beginning to open. Because they will let you," he said, "and they will be kind about it, and they will remember it. And one day, when it matters more than anything else, you will understand exactly how patient they have always been." He straightened. "It is a lesson we were given once. I suggest you take it without needing to pay our price for it." She looked at the open doors. At the vast chamber beyond, at the circular table at the center, where the delegates of the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy were taking their seats. At the human ambassador, Seraphine Okafor, sitting at the primary table now, not behind any pillar, her hands folded in front of her in the way she always held them, who happened to glance up at that moment and meet the young diplomat's eyes across the length of the hall. Okafor did not wave. She did not smile. She simply held the young diplomat's gaze for a moment with an expression that was calm and knowing and not unkind. Then she looked back down at her notes. The young diplomat took a breath. She walked into the chamber. The doors closed behind her, and somewhere in the dark between stars, 4,000 ships held their quiet positions and waited, patient as the space around them, for whatever the universe would ask of them next. The galaxy did not laugh. Not anymore. Not ever again.